All right, deep divers, welcome back. Ready for another fascinating journey into the world of global politics.
Absolutely.
Today we're tackling a concept that's both intriguing and a little bit mind-boggling, the idea of world government.
And trust me, this is one that sparks debate. I mean, are we talking about a utopian dream of global unity or a dystopian nightmare of global control?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a pretty polarizing topic, to say the least.
It is, and we'll be diving into the heart of that debate today, using some thought-provoking excerpts from a text that really dissects different models of how our world could be politically organized.
Perfect, because this one's especially relevant for our UPSC aspirants out there, especially those of you focused on international relations. But honestly, this is a topic that anyone who's ever thought about the future of our planet can sink their teeth into. So before we get lost in the theoretical weeds, let's make sure everyone's on board.
Right.
Hit that like button and subscribe to keep those deep dives coming. Now, when we say world government, what exactly are we talking about?
Imagine a single entity, a single governing body, making decisions for the entire planet. Kind of like a global version of a national government.
Whoa. Okay, so that's a pretty ambitious concept. I mean, is that even realistic?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and it's one that's been debated for centuries, believe it or not.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Philosophers like Zeno and Marcus Aurelius even pondered it back in ancient times.
Wow. So this is not just some new age idea.
Nope, not at all. And throughout history, you see thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Albert Einstein grappling with this concept too. Even figures like Winston Churchill and Mahatma Gandhi explored the idea of some kind of world order beyond the nation state.
So this isn't just some fringe theory. It's got some serious intellectual weight behind it.
Absolutely. And you can even see echoes of this ideal in the formation of organizations like the League of Nations and the United Nations.
Right. So there's a historical lineage here. But I still got to ask, why would anyone think a world government is a good idea in the first place? I mean, what's the core argument here?
Well, one way to think about it is to compare it to the role of government within individual states. We have governments to maintain order, right?
Right.
To prevent chaos among citizens,
Mhm.
to enforce laws. So the logic goes, could a world government do the same for nations?
Ah, so it's like taking the concept of governance and scaling it up to a planetary level. Prevent wars, resolve conflicts peacefully, that sort of thing.
Exactly. A way to create a more stable and peaceful world order.
Okay, I get the logic. But let's be realistic. Why haven't we seen a world government in action? What's the biggest roadblock?
Well, the biggest hurdle is probably the idea of sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
You see, for a world government to truly function, nations would have to willingly give up at least some of their sovereignty.
So their right to make their own decisions, govern themselves independently.
Exactly. And that's a tough pill to swallow for most countries. I mean, think about it. They'd be handing over some of their power to this global entity.
Yeah, not exactly something most leaders would be eager to do. I can imagine that negotiation would get a little messy.
To say the least. Even in regions where countries have close ties and shared interests, like the European Union, for example.
The EU.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even there, achieving a truly unified political identity has been, well, let's just say it's a work in progress.
So even with all those factors in their favor, close proximity, economic cooperation, even a shared currency in some cases, it's still tough to get everyone on the same page politically.
Exactly. And that just highlights how difficult it would be on a global scale.
Okay, so sovereignty is a major obstacle.
Oh,
Are there other reasons why people are skeptical about world government?
oh, definitely.
Like what?
Well, one major concern is the potential for unchecked power.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
I mean, a world government could theoretically become a global dictatorship.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And on a global scale, establishing those checks and balances, making sure power isn't concentrated in the hands of a few, would be incredibly complex.
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
Another big concern is the persistence of local and regional allegiances. People often feel a stronger connection to their immediate communities, their cultures, their nations, than to some abstract idea of global citizenship.
Right. It's like that age-old debate of nationalism versus globalism.
Yeah.
Our sense of identity often runs deep, rooted in our local communities and national affiliations.
Exactly. And then there's the challenge of ensuring democratic accountability on a global scale. How do you create a system that truly represents the voices and interests of billions of people from diverse cultures, backgrounds, and political systems?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a whole other level of complexity. Just thinking about fair representation and participation on a planetary scale, that's mind-boggling.
It is. And some argue that instead of striving for this single overarching world government, we might be better off focusing on strengthening global governance and fostering a sense of cosmopolitanism.
Okay, so that brings us to a key distinction. Global governance versus world government. Can you unpack that a little bit, especially for our UPSC folks? This seems like a pretty important concept to grasp.
Absolutely. Global governance is about managing global issues, but without the need for a centralized world government. It's more about states voluntarily working together to address shared problems.
So it's like recognizing that we're all facing these global challenges, but instead of having a single all-powerful entity calling the shots, it's more about nations choosing to cooperate with each other.
Exactly. And that's a key difference.
So in a nutshell, global governance is about finding ways to tackle global challenges through cooperation and coordination, but without creating this single overarching world government.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. But then how does this global governance thing actually work in practice? Like, what are its defining features?
Well, one of the key features of global governance is what we call polycentrism.
Polycentrism.
Yeah. It basically means that instead of having one centralized structure, global governance operates through multiple frameworks and decision-making processes.
Ah, so it's more like a network of interconnected systems, each one focused on a particular global challenge.
Exactly. And within this network, another key feature is intergovernmentalism. States still hold considerable power and generally prefer to reach decisions through consensus building rather than being dictated to by a central authority.
Got it. So nations still have a significant degree of autonomy and influence in the decision-making process. That's important to note, especially for our UPSC folks.
Absolutely. But here's where things get even more interesting. It's not just about governments anymore.
Oh,
Global governance also involves a mix of actors, including NGOs, corporations, and various elements of civil society. They all have a seat at the table.
so it's a much more inclusive and multifaceted approach to addressing global issues.
Precisely. And another important aspect is that global governance involves multi-level processes. This means that action and decision-making happen at various levels, simultaneously local, national, regional, and global.
Okay, so it's not just about what's happening on the world stage. It's also about how those global issues play out in different regions and communities around the world.
Exactly. The interconnectedness of global issues means that decisions made at one level can have ripple effects across other levels.
Makes sense.
And finally, a key feature of global governance is what we call deformalization.
Deformalization.
Yeah, it means that it often relies more on norms, informal agreements, and soft law, rather than strict legal structures.
So instead of relying solely on formal treaties and international laws, there's also this more informal realm where unwritten rules, diplomatic customs, and shared understandings play a significant role.
Exactly. Understanding these informal dynamics is just as important as mastering international law, especially for aspiring diplomats.
This is all incredibly insightful, especially for our listeners who are preparing for the UPSC exams. Understanding these nuances of global governance is really crucial for anyone who wants to navigate the world of international relations.
You're absolutely right. As future policymakers, you'll be tasked with understanding these global dynamics, representing your nation's interests, and contributing to shaping the future of international cooperation.
Right, and it's about recognizing that while national interests are important, they often intersect with these global challenges that require collective solutions.
Well, absolutely. And that's what makes this whole discussion of global governance so relevant. It provides a framework for understanding how nations can work together, even amidst their differences, to address those shared challenges.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, laying out the key features of global governance and why it's such a crucial concept to grasp.
Yeah.
But now I'm curious, how effective is this system really?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. Is it a genuine force for progress, or is it more of an idealistic concept that, falls short in practice?
It's a debate worth having, and one that we'll dive deeper into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started. We've laid the groundwork, and now it's time to get into the real meat of the matter. Make sure you're back for part 2 of our deep dive into global governance, where we'll unpack its effectiveness, analyze its limitations, and ultimately ask ourselves, is this the best we can do, or is there a better way forward?
Don't miss it. So, picking up where we left off, let's take a closer look at this whole idea of global governance. Is it really, a sign of progress, a way to effectively tackle the world's biggest challenges?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I mean, in theory, global governance sounds great. Nations coming together, finding common ground, working towards shared goals. But does it actually work that way in practice?
Well, the reality is often a bit more complicated. Remember, global governance relies heavily on voluntary cooperation and consensus building,
Right.
and that can be both a strength and a weakness.
Okay, how so?
Well, the strength of this approach is that it's flexible. It
Mm.
allows for, tailored solutions, recognizing that one size fits all just doesn't work in a world as diverse as ours. But this reliance on consensus can also be its downfall.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So the very nature of global governance needing everyone to agree can sometimes backfire.
Exactly. Take climate change, for instance. We know urgent action is needed, but getting all nations, with their different interests and priorities, to agree on a unified, decisive plan, that's a monumental task.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a challenge. And by the time everyone agrees, the problem's probably gotten worse.
Exactly. And that raises another question. How do you deal with nations that just aren't playing ball? Global governance doesn't have a central authority with the power to enforce agreements or punish those who violate the rules.
Right. So what happens when a country decides to go rogue?
Well, in those cases, the international community often relies on things like sanctions or diplomatic pressure. But these measures aren't always effective, and they can become very political.
So it's a system that relies heavily on goodwill, but there's no real way to guarantee that everyone will act in good faith.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that fundamental question. Is global governance truly effective?
Hmm.
Or is it more of an aspiration than a reality? To answer that, I think we need to look at some real-world examples, both successes and failures, and really examine the challenges this system faces.
All right, let's do that. Let's dive into those 5 key features of global governance we talked about earlier. But this time, let's look at them through the lens of effectiveness.
That's good.
First up, polycentrism.
Right, polycentrism. Remember, this means that global governance operates through multiple frameworks, multiple decision-making processes. This can be good, it allows for targeted solutions to specific problems, but it can also lead to fragmentation and lack of coordination.
So imagine you're dealing with a complex issue like cybersecurity, for example. You've got multiple international organizations, treaties, informal agreements, all dealing with different aspects of the problem. How do you even begin to navigate that and ensure that everyone's working together effectively?
It's a huge challenge, and it highlights one of the key downsides of polycentrism. You've got to make sure these different frameworks are working in harmony, not at cross purposes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about intergovernmentalism? How does that play into the effectiveness of global governance?
Well, remember, intergovernmentalism emphasizes the importance of states, right?
Right.
They're the ones negotiating agreements, setting the agenda, ultimately holding the power. But in a world where non-state actors are playing an increasingly influential role, NGOs, multinational corporations, all of the question becomes, is the state-centric approach still effective?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, think about the role of NGOs in advocating for things like human rights or environmental protection, or the influence of multinational corporations on global trade and finance. These aren't states, but they're wielding significant power on the world stage.
They are. And the challenge for global governance is figuring out how to incorporate these diverse voices, making sure the decision-making process is inclusive and not just dominated by states.
So it's like this balancing act between recognizing the power of states and making space for these other influential players.
Exactly.
Okay, what about mixed actor involvement? I mean, we've talked about the importance of having these different actors at the table, states, NGOs, corporations, civil society groups, but can they actually work together effectively?
That's the key question, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to have everyone in the room, but it's another thing entirely to get them to collaborate and find common ground.
Right, because they're often coming to the table with very different interests and agendas.
They are. And navigating those differences, building consensus, and ensuring that everyone feels heard and represented, that's no easy feat.
Speaking of complex dynamics, how does the multi-level nature of global governance play into all of this? You know, the fact that you have these local, national, regional, and global levels all interacting.
Right. Well, the multi-level nature of global governance means that solutions have to work on all those different levels, which can be a good thing. It allows for tailored approaches that take local context into account,
Right.
but it also creates a huge coordination challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. Trying to get everyone on the same page across all those different levels of governance must be incredibly difficult.
It is. And if the communication breaks down or if there's a lack of coordination, it can really hinder the effectiveness of the whole system.
Okay, so we've talked about polycentrism, intergovernmentalism, mixed actor involvement, and multi-level processes. All of these are pretty complex in their own right.
They are.
And they all present some unique challenges to the effectiveness of global governance. What about the last feature we discussed, deformalization? How does that play into the effectiveness of the system?
Right. So deformalization, remember, this is the reliance on norms, informal agreements, soft law, all those things that aren't necessarily legally binding.
Right.
And this can be both a good thing and a bad thing. On the one hand, it allows for more flexibility and adaptability. Global governance can respond more quickly when it doesn't have to rely on these long, drawn-out treaty-making processes.
So it's a quicker, more agile way to address emerging issues.
Exactly. But the downside is that norms and informal agreements lack the enforcement power of law. There's no global police to make sure everyone's following the rules.
So it all comes down to trust then.
In a lot of ways, yes. The effectiveness of deformalization really depends on the goodwill of states and their willingness to adhere to these informal understandings.
I mean, that goodwill breaks down.
Yeah. Well, that's when things can get messy. And it highlights a fundamental tension within global governance. It aspires to create a more just and equitable world order,
Right.
but it lacks the real power to enforce that vision. So much of its effectiveness hinges on the willingness of states to cooperate, even when it might not be in their immediate self-interest.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
It is, and it requires a really deep understanding of both the strengths and limitations of global governance as a system.
Okay, we've explored the 5 key features of global governance,
Yeah.
but I feel like we've just scratched the surface. What else should we be thinking about when we're assessing the effectiveness of this system, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there? What are some key takeaways?
Well, one crucial aspect is the issue of accountability. Who's holding these different actors accountable for their actions? How do we ensure transparency and prevent abuses of power within a system that's so diffuse and multi-layered?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
It is, and one that deserves more attention. We also can't forget about resources, both financial and human.
Right. Even with the best intentions, global governance initiatives need adequate funding and expertise to be effective.
Exactly. And this all highlights the importance of going beyond the theory. It's not enough to just understand the concepts. You have to be able to analyze how they play out in the real world, how they impact policy decisions, and ultimately how they shape the course of international relations.
So for our listeners, especially those future diplomats and policymakers, it's not just about memorizing definitions. It's
Yeah.
about developing that critical eye, that ability to assess real-world situations and figure out what works, what doesn't, and what needs to change.
Well said.
And that brings us back to that fundamental question: is global governance, with all its complexities and imperfections, the best we can do?
Or is there a better way? A way to create a more just and sustainable world order that's not just an aspiration, but a reality.
Those are the questions we'll grapple with in the final part of our deep dive. We'll examine alternative models, explore the potential for reform, and consider what role each of us can play in shaping a future where global governance truly lives up to its promise.
Don't miss it.
Welcome back, deep divers. We've explored the world government concept, we've delved into the complexities of global governance, and now, in this final part, I think it's time to shift gears a bit.
It is.
We've laid out the challenges, we've analyzed the strengths and weaknesses, but now I want to talk about solutions.
Right. Where do we go from here?
Exactly. If global governance is the most viable path forward for now, how can we make it work better? What are the potential avenues for reform?
Well, one idea that's gaining some traction is this concept of multi-stakeholder governance.
Multi-stakeholder governance.
Yeah, it builds on that idea of mixed actor involvement we discussed earlier, but it takes it a step further. Imagine a system where it's not just states at the table, but NGOs, businesses, scientists, even citizen groups, all having a formal role in the decision-making process.
So it's not just about having a seat at the table. It's about actually giving these stakeholders real power and influence.
Exactly. And proponents of this approach argue that, it's necessary if we're going to address these increasingly complex, interconnected challenges we're facing.
Okay, I can see that. I mean, something like climate change, for example, it requires action from everyone, governments, corporate individuals, not just states.
Exactly.
But wouldn't this multi-stakeholder approach, wouldn't that make decision-making even more complex? Temperatures slow things down even further?
Well, that's a valid concern, and it highlights the need for, carefully designed mechanisms to ensure that this kind of system is both inclusive and effective.
Right, so you need clear guidelines, transparent processes, accountability mechanisms, all of that. Okay, so it's not just about, throwing everyone into a room and hoping for the best.
Right.
There needs to be structure. There needs to be a thoughtful approach to actually making it work.
Absolutely.
What other reform ideas are out there?
Well, another area that's ripe for reform is the way we finance global governance.
Financing.
Yeah. Right now, a lot of the funding for international organizations is voluntary, it's unpredictable, which makes it really difficult for them to operate effectively. So some people are proposing, what if a small portion of global tax revenue was dedicated to funding these global public goods?
Whoa, so like a global treasury.
Yeah,
essentially.
like something like that. I mean, it would require a huge amount of international cooperation and trust,
Right.
but it could have a massive impact.
Yeah, I can see that. It's definitely a bold idea.
It is, but it highlights the need for creative thinking when it comes to these global issues. We need to be willing to move beyond traditional models and really explore new solutions.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking,
Mm,
especially for our UPSC listeners out there. The world's changing rapidly, and the
yeah.
ability to think critically about these issues and come up with solutions, that's essential.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about some specific reform ideas, but let's step back for a minute.
Right.
If we want to create a truly effective global order,
Hmm.
what kind of mindset do we need? What values should be guiding our actions?
Well, I think one of the most important values is a sense of shared responsibility.
Shared responsibility.
Yeah, moving beyond those narrow national interests and recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our actions have global consequences.
Right, it's that whole idea of we're all in this together.
Exactly.
But it's not enough to just, acknowledge that, is it? We have to actually act on it.
Absolutely. And that's where the commitment to multilateralism comes in.
Multilaterally.
Yeah, working together through international institutions, through agreements, strengthening those institutions, reforming them where needed, creating new ones when necessary.
So it's about investing in that infrastructure of global cooperation, recognizing that we can't solve these problems on our own.
Exactly. And we also can't forget the importance of individual action.
Right.
I mean, global governance might seem like this big abstract concept, but ultimately it's shaped by the choices we make in our everyday lives.
So whether it's reducing our carbon footprint, supporting ethical businesses,
Yeah.
advocating for human rights,
Exactly. All those things matter.
it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and sustainable world.
Well said.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of world government and global governance, I think it's important to remember that this isn't just an academic exercise.
Right.
These are real issues with real consequences for people's lives.
They are.
And for our UPSC aspirants, the future of global governance, it's in your hands. You're the ones who are going to be shaping policy, navigating these complex challenges, and hopefully building a better world.
It's an exciting opportunity.
It is. And it all starts with understanding the issues, thinking critically, and being willing to challenge the status quo. So thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful. And for our dedicated UPSC students, we wish you all the best in your studies and in your future endeavors as global citizens. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who's interested in shaping a better world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Absolutely.